Montgomery, Alabama, April 1969. The air inside the Montgomery Coliseum was thick, not just with heat or the roar of 35,000 fans, but with tension. A tension that hummed beneath the stage lights, in the breath between songs, in the South's uneasy heartbeat, just 1 year after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And that night, Elvis Presley was about to step onto a Southern stage with 4 black women as his backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations. Some people had come to see the king of rock and roll. Others had come to see what would happen when he walked on stage beside them. Halfway through Suspicious Minds, it happened. A voice from the darkness, sharp, hateful, hurled a racial slur so vile it sliced through the music. The band stopped cold. The lights still blazed, but the sound was gone. The crowd froze. In that silence, Elvis Presley had to make a choice between his comfort and his conscience, between what was safe and what was right. What happened next would echo across America and change 4 women's lives forever. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand the country it happened in. In 1969, America was raw. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been signed, but laws didn't change hearts. The assassination of Dr. King the previous spring had left cities burning, families mourning, and a nation divided. The National Guard had patrolled American streets. The backlash against integration was still fierce, especially here in the Deep South. And Montgomery, this city, wasn't just any Southern town. It was the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. It was where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in 1955, where a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. led a bus boycott that would change history. By 1969, Montgomery was a city split in two, proud of its place in history, but haunted by the ghosts of its resistance. When Elvis Presley announced a concert here, with black performers featured prominently in his show, it didn't just draw attention. It drew a line in the sand. Elvis had always occupied a strange space in the racial politics of American music. He built his sound on rhythm and blues, on gospel and soul, the music of the Black South he'd grown up hearing through open church doors and local radio. To some, he was a bridge between worlds. To others, he was a thief. But by 1969, Elvis was no longer the raw, rebellious kid from Tupelo. He was a man with something to prove, not just musically, but morally. His decision to tour with the Sweet Inspirations wasn't just an artistic one, it was a statement. And the Sweet Inspirations weren't just any singers. Their leader, Cissy Houston, already a gospel legend, would one day be known as the mother of Whitney Houston, one of the greatest voices in history. Alongside her were Myrna Smith, Sylvia Shemwell, and Estelle Brown, veterans of the road, women who had sung behind Aretha Franklin, Wilson, Pickett, and countless others. They had spent years harmonizing behind the stars, often treated as invisible, even as their sound defined the music of an era. When Elvis brought them into his show for his 1969 live comeback, he did something bold. He didn't hide them in shadow. He dressed them in matching gowns, handed them their own microphones, and let the audience hear every note. It was a small act that meant everything. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's powerful manager, had warned him not to. He said it could cost ticket sales in the South. Elvis ignored him. The Sweet Inspirations had mixed feelings about touring through their home region. They knew the land's beauty and its cruelty, and they knew that standing on stage beside a white man could provoke more than applause. They rehearsed what to do if something went wrong, whether to keep singing or walk off, whether to answer hate with silence. When the night arrived, the air inside the Coliseum carried a charge everyone could feel. Some of the older white audience members stiffened when they saw 4 black women walk on stage beside Elvis. Younger fans cheered. Security had been doubled, not for any specific threat, but because everyone knew this was more than a concert. Backstage, Elvis was unusually quiet. The band would later say he seemed different that night, serious, focused, a man turning something over in his mind. Maybe he sensed what was coming. The Sweet Inspirations, meanwhile, went through their usual routine, warming up, checking their gowns, laughing softly to ease the tension. They'd performed in cities that were far more openly hostile than this one. But tonight felt different. The show began like any other, flashbulbs, screaming fans, the thrum of electric guitars. Elvis moved with power, confidence, and that strange combination of swagger and humility that made him irresistible. The Sweet Inspirations' harmonies wrapped around his voice like silk and fire. For the first hour, everything went perfectly. The music soared, the crowd roared, the tension began to loosen. And then came Suspicious Minds. The song was always a centerpiece of Elvis's new act, an anthem of doubt and devotion. The Sweet Inspirations' voices lifted the chorus higher, weaving gospel into rock and soul. They were halfway through when the slur rang out. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through everything. Elvis stopped singing. The guitar line fell silent. The microphones hung in the air. 35,000 people sat frozen in the humid stillness. The Sweet Inspirations stood motionless at their mics, shock, pain, and weary recognition flickering across their faces. They had been here before in different cities, different forms, but never like this, never so public. And Elvis Presley, standing center stage under the white-hot lights, looked out into the crowd, his jaw tight, his hand trembling slightly on the microphone, and made his choice. What he said next would stop the South in its tracks. The silence after that slur felt endless. 1,000 faces turned toward the darkness where the voice had come from, but no one spoke. The band looked to Elvis, waiting. The Sweet Inspirations stood rooted in place, their expression suspended between disbelief and something older, an understanding of how quickly admiration could turn to hate. Elvis didn't move for several seconds. His eyes swept the crowd. Then he took a slow breath, lowered his microphone, and stepped to the very edge of the stage. The spotlight followed him. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clean and sharp, to every corner of the arena. "Stop right there," he said. The words cut through the silence like a blade. "We're not playing another note until something's made clear." The audience, 35,000 strong, fell completely still. You could hear the hum of the amplifiers, the shuffle of a shoe against the concrete floor. "I heard what was said," Elvis continued, his tone steady but trembling with anger. "A lot of you did too. And I want everyone here to understand something." He turned to the women behind him. The Sweet Inspirations were motionless, their gowns glinting in the light. Myrna Smith's eyes shimmered with tears. "These ladies," Elvis said, pointing toward them, "are not just my backup singers. They're not just here to make me sound good, though Lord knows they do that. These women are artists. They are my colleagues. They are my friends." He paused. Then, with deliberate weight, added, "And they are my family." The word hung in the air like an electric current. In 1969, Alabama, to call 4 black women family wasn't just a defense, it was defiance. Elvis's voice grew stronger. "I grew up in Mississippi. I know what it's like to be poor. I know what hate sounds like. And I know that music, this music, belongs to everyone." He turned back to the crowd, scanning the faces beneath the lights. "So here's the deal," he said. "If you can't show these women respect, if you can't listen to them sing without hate in your heart, then the doors are right there." He gestured toward the exits. "They're easy to find. You can leave right now." He took a step closer to the edge of the stage. "Because this stage, this show, this music, it doesn't belong to people who look like me. It belongs to all of us." For a heartbeat, no one moved. It was as if the entire arena had stopped breathing. Then, somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands began to clap, then another, then dozens more. Within seconds, the applause swelled into a roar. People were on their feet, some crying, some shouting Elvis's name. but not everyone stood. In sections of the crowd, faces remained stony, arms crossed. A few people rose, not to cheer but to leave. Security guards later said a few hundred walked out that night, angry, muttering, some cursing under their breath. One or two? Scuffles broke out near the exits as others tried to stop them from going, but the majority stayed. Elvis stood at center stage, his face unreadable. Behind him, the sweet inspirations were crying openly now. They had spent their careers enduring racism in silence, swallowing it just to keep working. But here, before thousands, a white superstar had drawn a line for them, and meant it. Then, something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the crowd, no one ever learned who started it, a voice began to sing, softly at first, then louder. "We shall overcome." Others joined in, their voices rising through the arena. Elvis turned, looked at the sweet inspirations, and nodded. They lifted their microphones and began to harmonize, their gospel-trained voices soaring above the crowd's raw emotion. And then Elvis joined them. His voice, low, steady, unmistakable, merged with theirs and with the thousands in the seats, until the whole Coliseum was singing together. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't planned. It was something bigger, a spontaneous act of unity in a place where division had always ruled. When the song ended, the crowd didn't cheer right away. They stood in silence as if they'd witnessed something sacred. Elvis wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Then he turned to Cissy Houston and asked, "What do y'all want to sing next?" The women exchanged glances, leaned together, and whispered a few words. Cissy smiled, a small, weary but proud smile, and told him quietly. Elvis nodded. He turned to the band leader, murmured instructions, and stepped back from the microphone. What happened next was unprecedented. For the first time in his career, Elvis Presley ceded the stage entirely. The sweet inspirations stepped forward into the light. Elvis stood behind them, silent, his hands clasped, his head slightly bowed. They began to sing "People Get Ready," the Curtis Mayfield gospel soul classic about hope and deliverance. Their harmonies filled the arena like a prayer. They sang not as background voices, but as the stars they had always been. The crowd listened in reverent stillness, some holding hands, some weeping openly. It felt less like a concert than a sermon, less entertainment than healing. When the final note faded, the audience erupted. The standing ovation lasted minutes. Myrna Smith would later say it was the most powerful moment of her entire life. Elvis stepped forward again, his voice quieter now. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing to the four women beside him, "the sweet inspirations." The applause swelled again. From that point on, the concert was different. The energy was softer, more intimate. Elvis spoke between songs, telling stories about his childhood, about hearing black gospel on the radio in Tupelo, about his mother working alongside black women in the laundry, about how those rhythms had shaped his soul long before fame ever found him. He wasn't preaching. He was explaining, trying in his own way, to make his audience understand where their music really came from. For the rest of the night, he treated the sweet inspirations not as supporting players, but as equals. He introduced them by name, praised their careers, told the crowd who they had sung for. The show ended not with a flourish, but with quiet grace. Elvis took a final bow, then turned toward the women behind him. They joined hands and walked off the stage together. No fireworks, no encore, just solidarity. Outside, the Alabama night was thick and humid, but something had shifted in the air, something larger than one performance. Elvis Presley had crossed a line most white entertainers in the South would never touch. He had risked his career, his safety, and his standing with his own audience. And he had done it for four women who had spent their lives singing in the shadows. That night in Montgomery, they sang in the light. News of what happened in Montgomery spread before dawn. The next morning, local radio stations were flooded with calls. Some voices trembled with outrage, others with pride. By noon, the story had moved beyond Alabama. By evening, it was national news. The Montgomery Advertiser ran the headline, "Elvis Takes Stand on Race at Concert." The article described the slur, the silence, and the speech that followed, quoting Elvis's words in full. Within days, newspapers across the country picked it up. Some praised his courage, others called it reckless. But everyone agreed it was something new. For years, Elvis Presley had been a figure people projected their own stories onto, the rebel, the symbol of integration, the Southern boy made good. Now he was something else, a man who had chosen conscience over comfort in the heart of Dixie. Behind the headlines, though, the consequences were real. Several Southern venues quietly withdrew offers for future tour dates. Local radio stations in conservative markets reduced or stopped playing his records. Colonel Tom Parker was furious, not because he disagreed with Elvis's words, but because he saw the fallout in dollars and cents. But Elvis didn't back down. When a reporter from the Nashville Banner asked if he regretted what he said, he replied simply, "I couldn't keep singing like nothing happened." Letters poured into his fan club offices, thousands of them. Roughly 60% were supportive. The rest were filled with anger, betrayal, even hate. Some were so vile that law enforcement got involved. Threats against his life began arriving regularly. Elvis had faced obsessive fans and stalkers before, but this was different. These weren't people who wanted him. These were people who wanted him gone. His security team was expanded. He began traveling with armed guards, and for a while, the tension shadowed every performance. But even as doors closed in some parts of the South, others began to open. The sweet inspirations, once known mostly to industry insiders, suddenly found themselves in the spotlight. Magazine writers sought them out for interviews. Television shows invited them to talk about the Montgomery concert. Record labels came calling. For the first time, audiences who had never bothered to learn their names knew exactly who they were. In one interview, Cissy Houston said, "Elvis didn't save us. We didn't need saving. But he stood up when it counted, and that made a difference." Myrna Smith later put it more bluntly. "He could have stayed quiet. He didn't. That's all you need to know about the man." Inside the music industry, Elvis's stand sent ripples far beyond his tour. Other white performers began re-evaluating how they worked with black musicians. Some followed his lead, making sure their black collaborators were introduced by name on stage or photographed equally in press shots. Others went further, speaking openly about the racism they'd seen in the business. A few venues even started adding anti-discrimination clauses to concert contracts, something unheard of just months before. Elvis had unintentionally set a precedent, not just for what a musician could sing, but for what they could say. Privately, the Montgomery concert changed Elvis himself. Those close to him said he spoke more often afterward about where his music came from. He'd always known it. He'd just never said it so publicly. But now he did. In interviews, he began naming names: Arthur Crudup, Big Mama Thornton, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, artists who had shaped rock and roll long before he did. He told one journalist, "I didn't invent this music. I just got lucky enough to sing it." It was a small sentence. But for a man who had spent a decade being called the king, it was a profound act of humility. He also deepened his relationship with the Sweet Inspirations. They became more than his backing group. They were his friends. He'd invite them to dinner after shows, ask about their families, their faith, their experiences. He listened. He asked questions about things he'd never lived: segregation, police harassment, the constant low hum of being judged for the color of your skin. Those conversations left a mark. He began to see his own life differently, the way fame had insulated him, the way privilege had disguised itself as normalcy. When Whitney Houston, Cissy's daughter, began singing as a child, Elvis told her mother, "That girl's got something special. Don't let anybody tell her she can't do it all. It wasn't just talk. He made sure she and the other women had the best treatment, hotel rooms equal to the band's, pay that matched their worth. For a white artist in 1969, especially in the South, those weren't small gestures, they were revolutionary ones. But the stand came with a shadow. Elvis's growing security detail made him more isolated. The death threats never fully stopped. Friends said he seemed more withdrawn in the months that followed, more cautious, more inward. Some biographers later suggested that this tightening circle, this constant awareness of danger, helped feed his later struggles with prescription drugs and control, that it deepened the divide between the public Elvis and the private man who just wanted peace. Still, he never expressed regret about Montgomery. In one of his final interviews years later, when asked if he'd ever feared losing fans because of mixing races on stage, Elvis smiled and said, "If you lose people doing what's right, you don't really lose them. You find yourself." For the Sweet Inspirations, the concert became a defining chapter in their story. It wasn't just the night Elvis defended them. It was the night the industry finally had to see them. Their bookings increased. They released new records under their own name. Audiences who'd once ignored them began lining up for autographs. And though racism didn't vanish overnight, the Montgomery moment had changed the rules of what was possible. Estelle Brown later said, "We'd been in the background for so long. That night, we stepped into the light, and Elvis made sure we stayed there." By the end of 1969, the civil rights movement had moved into a new phase. The marches were fewer, the headlines less fiery, but the work was still happening in schools, in workplaces, in culture. And that's where Elvis's moment fit best. Not in politics, but in culture. He had done what artists do at their best, taken the values of his time and forced them into conversation with conscience. He didn't preach. He didn't pose. He simply refused to let hate run the show. And in doing so, he reminded America that change doesn't only happen in courts or congresses. Sometimes it happens under bright lights, before a crowd, when someone with a microphone decides to tell the truth. Time has a way of softening memories, of turning fire into folklore. But some nights don't fade. Some moments burn their shape into history so deeply that even decades later you can still feel the heat. Montgomery, April 1969, was one of those nights. For Elvis Presley, it marked a quiet turning point. He would never again perform as the same man who'd walked onto that stage. In the months that followed, he carried a different kind of awareness with him, a sense that fame wasn't just a privilege, but a platform. His concerts became more intentional. His song choices shifted subtly. Gospel numbers like "How Great Thou Art" and "Peace in the Valley" began to take on new weight, framed not as spectacle, but as confession. And when he toured, he made sure the Sweet Inspirations remained part of his sound. He insisted they appear on camera during televised specials, their names printed clearly on programs, their harmonies given space to breathe. He'd joke during rehearsals, "They make me sound like I know what I'm doing." But behind the humor was respect, a reverence he never stopped showing. Over the next several years, Elvis's reputation continued to evolve. To his critics, he was still a paradox, a man caught between rebellion and reverence, gospel and glitter, Southern boy and world star. But to those who'd seen what happened that spring night, he was something simpler, a man who had finally stood still long enough to stand up. When civil rights historian Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan was later asked about the concert, she said, "Elvis didn't become an activist that night. He became accountable." In the decades that followed, the legend of the Montgomery concert grew. Footage from the show was rumored to exist, though none ever surfaced. Some said Colonel Parker had ordered the tapes destroyed to avoid controversy. Others believed they were quietly archived by RCA and lost to time. What remained were eyewitness accounts, stagehands, fans, local reporters. Their stories varied in detail, but not in spirit. Every version carried the same heartbeat, the same moment of silence, the same voice that broke it, the same line drawn in the dust of history. As America changed, so did the way people looked at Elvis's stand. In the 1970s, during his Vegas years, some dismissed it as a brief flash of conscience swallowed by show business. But for others, especially black musicians who had long been overshadowed by white imitators, it meant something lasting. In interviews decades later, artists like Mavis Staples and Al Green would recall that concert as a turning point. He used his voice in a way most white stars wouldn't, Staples said. That mattered. For the Sweet Inspirations, the memory never dulled. Even as their careers took new turns, singing with Aretha Franklin, Dionne Warwick, Dusty Springfield, they carried that night with them like a hidden medal. When Myrna Smith passed away in 2010, one of the photographs displayed at her memorial was from that tour. Elvis standing just behind the four women, smiling as they sang. The caption beneath it read simply, "Family." Elvis's own life would take a darker turn in the 1970s. The fame that had lifted him eventually began to crush him. The long tours, the loneliness, the growing dependence on pills to sleep and wake again. But those close to him said that even in his final years, when the noise grew too loud, he would return to gospel songs, the music that had first connected him to something pure. He'd often call the Sweet Inspirations to his suite after a show, and they'd sing until dawn. No stage, no spotlight, just voices in harmony. In those private hours, the Montgomery night seemed to echo again, the courage, the connection, the unity that had once cut through hate. When Elvis died in 1977, tributes poured in from across the world. But among the most heartfelt came from the women who had stood beside him that night. In a televised interview, Cissy Houston said softly, "People talk about his voice, his fame, his jumpsuits, but what I remember is that he cared. When it mattered, he cared." Estelle Brown added, "He didn't see us as background, he saw us as part of the song." In the years that followed, scholars would debate Elvis's place in the story of American race relations. Was he a bridge or a barrier? A borrower or a believer? The Montgomery concert offered one answer, not a perfect one, but a human one. It showed a man who had grown up surrounded by both gospel and segregation, who had benefited from a system that gave white voices the microphone, and who, when the moment came, used that same microphone to speak against the very thing that had lifted him. He didn't fix America that night. He didn't erase history. But he did something equally rare. He listened, learned, and changed in public. 50 years later, in 2019, the city of Montgomery quietly commemorated the anniversary of the concert. The old arena was long gone, replaced by a civic center and a modest park. But on the anniversary night, a small crowd gathered, locals, historians, a few surviving members of Elvis's band. They played footage of the Sweet Inspirations performing "People Get Ready." The audio crackled through old speakers, their harmonies still luminous. And when the song ended, the MC read from a transcript of Elvis's speech. "Music doesn't belong to people who look like me," he read. "It belongs to all of us." For a long moment the crowd stood silent, listening, not just to the words, but to what they still meant. Then, softly, someone began to sing, "We shall overcome," and one by one the voices joined again. Today, that Montgomery concert exists somewhere between legend and fact, a story told in half-remembered quotes, faded clippings, and whispered pride. But maybe that's fitting, because what mattered wasn't the perfection of the details, it was the truth of the gesture. Elvis Presley didn't set out to make history that night. He set out to stop hate from having the last word. And in doing so, he proved that even in a world divided by race, religion, and fear, one man's voice, when used with courage, can still become a bridge a bridge made not of music or fame, but of something far more lasting, humanity.